The land was a promise, spoken in a language of lies. It promised breadth, a horizon so wide it suggested a man could own his own sky. It promised soil so black and rich it felt like a sin to walk upon it. But the promise was for summer. Winter was the truth, and the truth was a sentence of death handed down by a silent, indifferent judge. Elias Thorne knew this truth in his bones, a deep ancestral ache that the biting autumn wind seemed to find and amplify. He stood beside his brother Jacob on the small rise that separated their two claims. 200 yards of stubborn prairie grass and flinty rock lay between the raw, skeletal frames of their new homes. They were identical cabins, built from the same plan, from the same grudgingly purchased lumber hauled from the distant riverlands. They were stout, honest boxes, meant to defy the coming siege. But Elias saw them not as fortresses, but as tombs. Jacob clapped a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of forced bonhomie that failed to hide the tension in his grip. They stand square, brother. Master Henriksen himself said the joinery was clean. We'll be snug. Snugger than most. Elias didn't look at the cabins. His gaze was fixed on the ground between them, on the space that everyone else saw as empty. They are two islands, Jacob, and the sea is coming. Jacob grunted, kicking at a clump of sod. It's always a sea with you, Elias, or a wolf, or a razor. Can it not just be the wind? The same wind our father and his father faced? They did not face it here, Elias said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the ceaseless moan of the air moving over the plains. This is different. There are no trees to break its teeth. There is no hill to hide behind. It is just us and the wind and 1,000 miles of frozen anger behind it. This was Dakota Territory, 1886. The brothers had come west after losing their small Ohio farm to a bank's ledger and a season of bad rain. They had brought with them everything they owned: 2 wives, 4 children between them, a wagon of tools, and a shared, dwindling inheritance that had been almost entirely spent on the land, the lumber, and the cast-iron stove that now sat like a black idol in the center of each unfinished cabin. The stove was the heart of the conventional wisdom. It was the accepted, unquestioned god of winter survival. A big, pot-bellied tyrant that devoured wood and gave back a bubble of life-sustaining heat. Master Henriksen, the town's preeminent builder and dispenser of such wisdom, had sold them the stoves himself. "Feed it well," he'd said, patting the cold iron flank of one of the stoves as if it were a prized bull. "Feed it oak if you can find it, cottonwood if you must. It will keep the White Death from your door." The problem, Elias knew, was the feeding. The wood they had managed to cut and haul was stacked behind their cabins in 2 distressingly small ricks. It was mostly cottonwood, soft and quick to burn. It would not be enough. He had walked the horizon for days and seen nothing but grass. To get more wood meant a 3-day journey to the river, a journey that would be impossible once the real snows came. They had what they had, and what they had was a death sentence. "We need more wood, Jacob," Elias stated, finally turning to face his brother. Jacob's face, usually open and ruddy, was closed and tight. "There is no more. We have the allotment, the same as the Svensons, the same as the Millers. We make do. We huddle. We survive. That is the way. The Millers have 6 grown sons to haul wood. The Svensons have a copse of box elder on their claim. We have this." Elias swept a hand over the barren landscape. "And we have 4 small children who will not survive being huddled. Their breath will freeze on the blankets." This was the fear that lived in Elias's throat, a cold stone that made his words heavy. He saw his Anna and little Peter. their faces blue in the half-light of a starved fire. He saw Jakob's own girls, Clara and Sophia, shivering into a sleep from which they would not wake. It was this vision that had pushed him past sense, past the accepted way of things. It had driven him back to the forgotten words, the strange diagrams in the book his grandmother had left him. She was a woman of the old country, a Dane whose people had lived for generations on the stark volcanic shores of Iceland. She knew a different kind of cold and a different kind of warmth. The book was bound in sealskin, the pages brittle and filled with a spidery script. It spoke not of fighting the cold, but of borrowing its strength. It spoke not of fires that raged in the center of a room, but of a slow, steady heat that rose from the earth itself. Jordvarm. Earth warmth. There is another way, Elias said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Jakob sighed, the sound a plume of white in the cold air. Not the book, Elias, please. Not the old woman's fancies. We're in America. We build with square logs and hot iron. Her fancies kept her people alive where the trees would not grow for 1,000 years, Elias countered, his intensity growing. Look. He crouched down, grabbing a sharp rock and scratching in the dirt. He drew 2 squares, our cabins. Then he drew a spot midway between them. Here, we dig a central pit, deep, 10 feet. We wall it with stone. Jakob watched, his arms crossed, a look of profound skepticism etched onto his features. From the base of that pit, Elias continued, his hand trembling slightly with the force of his conviction, we dig 2 tunnels, trenches, 1 to each cabin. They run directly beneath the center of the floors. We line them with flat stones, top and bottom. We make a covered stone channel, a route, a shared route that connects us. A ditch, Jakob said flatly. You want us to spend our last strength digging a ditch. It is not a ditch. It is a flue, a lung. We build a single, small, slow-burning fire in the deep pit, a fire of sod, of dried manure, of the little wood we have. The smoke and heat will not go up a chimney, not at first. It will be drawn along the stone-lined roots. The stones will drink the heat. The great mass of the earth around the stones will drink the heat. The very ground beneath our floors will become a reservoir of warmth. It will radiate up, gently, constantly. One fire, Jakob. One small, efficient fire to warm 2 families. Jakob stared at the drawing in the dirt for a long time. He looked at his brother's wild, pleading eyes. He looked at the 2 lonely cabins. He looked at the sky, which was the color of slate, and promised nothing but misery. It is folly, he said. But the words lacked the certainty they should have had. The ground will sweat. It will rot the floorboards. The smoke will fill the houses and kill us in our sleep. Master Henriksen would laugh himself sick. Let him laugh, Elias shot back. Master Henriksen has a stand of oak behind his house, thick as a king's army. He does not know our calculus. His wisdom is for the rich. My grandmother's wisdom is for the poor, for us. This was the heart of it. They were not like the others. They had arrived late, with less. They were on the margin, and the margin was the first place the winter wolves came to hunt. The next day, they went to town for the last of their supplies. They found Master Henriksen at the lumber yard, overseeing the loading of a massive wagon. He was a barrel of a man, with a beard that seemed to contain its own weather system, and a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. Jakob, pushed by a lingering sense of duty to the conventional, explained their wood shortage. Henriksen nodded sagely. Aye, it's a lean year for latecomers. You'll need to be frugal. Bank your fires at night. Keep the family in one room. Wear your coats to bed. You'll manage. The Thorn Boys are made of stout stuff." It was then that Elias, unable to contain the urgency, stepped forward. He explained his idea. He spoke of the central pit, the stone-lined flues, the Jordvarm. Henriksen listened, his head cocked. At first, his expression was one of simple confusion. Then, slowly, a deep, rumbling chuckle started in his belly. It grew until it was a full-throated laugh, a sound of such complete and utter derision that men stopped their work to turn and look. "A root?" he boomed, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "You want to bury your fire? Son, the fire goes in the house, not under it. You are not a gopher. What you're describing is a recipe for smoke poisoning and a damp, rheumatic death. You'll draw the frost right out of the ground and into your bones." He turned to the other men. "The Thorn Boy wants to live in a chimney." The men laughed with him. It was a chorus of ridicule, the sound of settled wisdom dismissing foolish innovation. Elias felt his face burn with shame, but his resolve hardened into something cold and sharp. Henriksen sobered, his tone shifting to one of condescending pity. "Listen to me, boy. I have built 50 homes on this prairie. I know what works. A good foundation, tight walls, and a hot stove. Do not try to reinvent the hearth. You will only get burned. Or in this case," he chuckled again, "you will freeze while smelling of soot." He clapped Jakob on the back. "Keep your brother from his folly. Stick to the plan. A hot fire in a good stove. There is no other way." They left the town under a cloud of mockery. The story of Thorn's folly and the gopher hole hearth would be the talk of the settlement for days. Jakob was silent for the entire ride back, his jaw set like iron. As they unhitched the horses, he turned to Elias. "He is right. They are all right. It is madness. We will be the laughingstock of the territory, and then we will be 2 frozen families to be pitied in the spring." "So you will choose a dignified death?" Elias asked, his voice raw. "You will watch your children freeze, knowing there was something, anything, we could have tried?" "I will not. If Annalise and my children are to die, it will not be because I was too proud to listen to the wisdom of a dead woman and too afraid of the laughter of fools." He grabbed a shovel from the wagon. "I begin today," he said. "I will dig my half of the root. You can build a wall between our claims if you wish, but I will not sit here and wait for the cold to take us." He walked to the midpoint between the 2 cabins, to the spot he had marked. He raised the shovel high and drove it into the unyielding prairie soil. The sound was a dull thud, a lonely declaration of war against the sky, the wind, and the collected wisdom of his time. For a long time, Jacob just stood there, torn between the shame of ridicule and the terror of his brother's words. He looked at his own cabin, which suddenly seemed flimsy and inadequate. He looked at his meager woodpile, a pathetic bulwark against the coming ice age. He heard the laughter of the men in town, but beneath it, he heard the imagined, future cries of his own daughters. With a curse that was half prayer, half surrender, he grabbed the other shovel. He walked to stand beside his brother. "God help us," Jacob said, plunging his shovel into the earth. "God help the foolish Thorn brothers." The work was brutal. The topsoil was a thin, grudging layer that gave way to a dense, clay-like substrate riddled with stones that ranged from the size of a fist to the size of a man's head. Each shovelful was a battle. Their hands, soft from farming, were soon a mass of bleeding blisters. Their backs screamed in protest. For the first few days, Jakob worked in a sullen, resentful silence. Every rock that turned the edge of his shovel, every yard of dirt that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, was proof of this folly. He was a farmer, not a miner. He was supposed to be working with the earth, not against it. Elias worked with a feverish intensity. He was powered by the images in his grandmother's book and the terror in his own heart. When they weren't digging, he was reading the brittle pages by candlelight, cross-referencing her sketches of stone patterns and flue designs. "The angle is crucial," he explained to a skeptical Jakob one evening, his finger tracing a diagram. "It cannot be steep, or the heat will rush through too fast and escape. It must be a gentle, almost imperceptible rise from the fire pit to the space beneath the cabins. Just enough to draw the smoke, but not enough to hurry it. The heat must be made to linger, to seep into the stones." They had to become masons as well as excavators. The fields for miles around were their quarry. They hauled thousands of pounds of flat, dense field stones on a crude sledge, their muscles burning with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Elias was exacting. He rejected stones that were too porous or too small. "They must have mass," he insisted, tapping a large gray slab of granite. "Mass is a battery for heat. We are not just building a channel, we are building a core of warmth that will live inside the earth." As they dug, they laid the foundation for the root, a flat, solid bed of stones, fitted together like a puzzle. Then they built up the sidewalls, carefully, ensuring there were no gaps for the earth to crumble through. It was slow, agonizing work. They were racing the sun, which fell toward the horizon earlier each day, and the frost, which was already stiffening the ground each morning. Their wives, Anneliese and Birgitta, watched with a mixture of hope and fear. Anneliese, Elias's wife, had seen the grandmother's book. She had heard the old stories. She believed in the deep magic of forgotten things. She brought them water and food, and her presence was a silent affirmation that kept Elias going when his body threatened to quit. Birgitta, Jakob's wife, was more practical. She saw the dwindling woodpile and the laughing stock their family had become. "Jakob," she pleaded one night, her voice a fearful whisper, "Henriksen was in the town today. He says you are digging your own graves. He says the ground damp will kill the children with lung fever before the cold can take them." "Elias says it will be a dry heat," Jakob answered, his voice weary. He could not meet her eyes. He himself was not sure what he believed anymore. He was caught in the gravity of his brother's conviction, a force as powerful and inexplicable as the turning of the earth itself. The mockery was a constant, unwelcome visitor. Men from the settlement would ride out on their way to hunt or check traps. They would stop at the ridge and watch the two brothers toiling in their great trench. The project was now a massive scar on the landscape, a deep, 10-foot pit in the center, with two long, stone-lined arms reaching out towards the cabins. "Still digging to China, Thorn?" one would call out, and the others would laugh. Master Henriksen came himself one afternoon. He dismounted his horse and walked to the edge of the pit, peering down at Elias and Jacob, who were covered in dirt and sweat. "I came to make you an offer," Henriksen said, his tone one of weary authority. "Fill this madness in. I will advance you a cord of good oak on credit, enough to see you through to January. It will be a heavy debt, but your children will live to help you repay it." Jacob stopped digging. He looked at Elias, his eyes asking the question. This was a lifeline, a return to sanity. Elias looked up at Henriksen, his face a mask of grime, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "And what happens in February, Master Henriksen? When your cord of wood is ash and the winter is still here? Will you sell us another? And another after that? Until we are your slaves for the rest of our lives, all for the privilege of freezing a little more slowly?" He plunged his shovel back into the earth. "We thank you for the offer, but we will keep our debt to the ground. It asks only for our sweat, not our souls." Henriksen shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "You are a prideful fool, Elias Thorne. I hope your family does not have to pay the price for it." He rode away, and that was the last time anyone came to mock them. From then on, they were simply ignored, written off as lost. The final stage of the construction was the most delicate. They had to tunnel the last few feet under the foundations of the cabins themselves. They shored up the log sills with heavy beams and dug with small hand trowels, terrified of a collapse. Once the channels were complete, they laid the heavy capstones over the top, sealing the root. They packed the earth back over it, tamping it down, burying their immense labor until the ground looked almost as it had before, save for the deep central pit and the two small stone-lined openings that disappeared under the cabins. Inside the houses, they laid the floorboards, leaving a 6-inch air gap above the dirt floor, creating a hollow space, a plenum, for the heat to gather before rising. The floor was, in essence, the primary radiator. Finally, they built a chimney. Not from the cabins, but a single, tall, slender chimney of stone and clay that rose from the central fire pit. It had a simple, clever damper system Elias had designed based on his grandmother's notes. A heavy stone plug that could be partially or fully opened to control the draw. The first fire was a moment of supreme tension. They used dried sod and a few precious pieces of cottonwood. Elias lit the fire himself. It caught slowly, a smoldering, smoky affair. At first, the smoke billowed from the pit, refusing the invitation of the flues. Jakob's face fell. "It is a failure," he whispered. "Patience," Elias breathed, adjusting the chimney damper. "It needs to learn its path." He partially blocked the top of the pit with a large, flat stone, forcing the smoke to seek another escape. Slowly, miraculously, the column of smoke wavered and was then drawn, as if by a great, subterranean breath, into the dark mouths of the two stone roots. They ran to the cabins. Pressing their hands to the wooden floorboards, they felt nothing. For an hour, they waited, their hope dwindling with the fading light. Jakob began to pace, the picture of despair. And then, Anneliese, who had been sitting quietly in a corner, spoke a single word. "Listen." They fell silent. A low, deep hum was coming from the ground, the sound of a distant river. It was the sound of air moving through the stone channels. Elias lay flat on the floor, pressing his cheek to the wood. "It is coming," he whispered. And then he felt it. Not a blast of heat, like from a stove, but a slow, pervasive warmth. A deep, gentle heat that seemed to be rising from the very bones of the world. It was the heat of a sun-baked rock at dusk, a warmth that felt ancient and alive. Within hours, the entire floor of both cabins was warm to the touch. The air inside, which had always held the sharp, damp chill of the prairie, softened. The cold was not driven back. It was simply erased, replaced by a steady, even, room-filling comfort. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The warmth was everywhere. They had done it. 2 weeks later, the sky fell. It did not begin with a gentle flurry. It began with a change in the color of the light, a sickly yellow-gray that swallowed the sun. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell silent. An unnatural, terrifying stillness settled over the plains. The animals knew. The few prairie birds vanished. A lone coyote trotted past their cabins without a sound, its head low, moving with a desperate purpose. Then came the noise. A low moan from the north. A sound that was not wind, but the approach of something vast and solid. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. "It is here," Elias said, his voice grim. "The Great White Death." The first flakes were small and hard, like grains of sand. They were driven by a vanguard of wind that quickly rose to a piercing shriek. Within an hour, the world outside their windows ceased to exist. It was a churning, roaring vortex of white. Visibility was not a matter of yards, but of inches. To step outside the door was to be swallowed whole. This was the blizzard of 1887, a storm that would be spoken of in hushed, fearful tones for 100 years. Inside the Thorn cabins, a strange peace reigned. Elias kept the fire in the central pit fed. It was a small, lazy fire, mostly of dried manure and sod bricks they had prepared, with only one small log of cottonwood added every few hours. It required a fraction of the fuel a normal stove would demand. The warmth in their homes remained constant, a gentle, unassailable presence. The children played on the warm floorboards. Annalise and Birgitta baked bread on a flat stone set over the opening to the flue, the smell of it filling the small space with a sense of defiant normalcy. They were two small arcs of life, adrift on a sea of frozen chaos. Miles away, in his fine, stoutly built house, Master Henriksen was fighting a losing war. His magnificent iron stove, the pride of the county, was a ravenous beast. It demanded wood constantly, roaring as it converted his precious oak into a cone of heat that barely reached the walls of the main room. The wind was a physical force, pressing against his house, seeking every tiny crack, every chink in the mortar. It drove the cold in like millions of tiny knives. The windows were opaque, with a crystalline tracery of frost. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block of ice. His wife and 3 children were huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Their faces were pale, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. Beyond the immediate circle of the stove's heat, the room was arctic. "More wood, Pa!" his son whispered, his teeth chattering. Henriksen went to the wood box. It was nearly empty. He had already burned through a week's supply in a single day. He looked at his wood pile from the window, but it was just a vague white mound, unreachable, buried in the screaming whiteness. He had been so confident in his preparations, so certain of his own wisdom. That confidence was now turning to a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. The storm raged for 3 days. 3 days of an unbroken, howling gale and blinding snow. On the 3rd night, Henriksen burned the last of the wood in the box. He broke up a kitchen chair, then a small table. The dry, varnished wood burned hot and fast, a fleeting reprieve. When that was gone, there was nothing. The fire in the stove dwindled to a bed of glowing embers. The monstrous cold, which had been held at bay, flooded the room. The temperature inside the house began to plummet. He looked at his wife, her face a mask of terror. He looked at his youngest daughter, who was shivering uncontrollably in her sleep. He was a master builder. His house was the best built in the territory, and they were going to freeze to death in it. It was in that moment of absolute despair that a thought, a memory, surfaced through his fear. The Thorn brothers, the fools, the gophers digging their own graves. He pictured their pathetic little woodpiles. They must have frozen days ago. Their cabins would be silent tombs. But they had wood. If he could get to it, if he could just salvage their wood, his family might live. It was a desperate, ghoulish thought, but survival had stripped him of his pride. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he possessed, wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible, and took down the heavy rope by the door. He tied one end to the iron stove and the other around his waist. He would follow the rope back. It was his only chance. He opened the door and was thrown back by a physical blow of wind and ice. He crawled out into the maelstrom, pulling the door shut behind him. The world was pure, violent chaos. He could not see, he could only feel. He knew the direction of the thorn claims by instinct, and he began to crawl, a desperate, freezing man moving through the heart of a white hurricane. The journey of a few miles took him hours. He was guided by a grim, single-minded purpose. He was nearly frozen, his beard a solid block of ice, his limbs numb and clumsy. He fell into drifts and clawed his way out. He was about to give up, to surrender to the warm, sleepy death that the cold was promising him, when he blundered into something solid. A wall. A cabin. He fumbled along it, searching for the door. There was no light from the windows, no smoke from a chimney, just a silent, snow-shrouded box. He had been right. They were dead. He raised a frozen fist and hammered on the door, more as a final act of defiance against the storm than with any expectation of an answer. He hammered and hammered, shouting their names, his voice instantly ripped away by the wind. And then, a sound. A bolt being drawn. The door opened. The first thing that hit him was not light, but warmth. A wave of gentle, pervasive heat that was so profound, so utterly impossible, it felt like a hallucination. It washed over his frozen body, and the shock of it almost made him faint. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway, holding a simple lantern. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Henriksen could see Elias's wife, Annalise, knitting in a chair. His two small children were asleep on a blanket on the floor, their faces rosy and peaceful. The air was not smoky, it was clean, and it carried a smell that shattered Henriksen's understanding of the world. The smell of fresh bread. He stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor, the impossible warmth of the floorboards seeping into his frozen limbs. He stared, bewildered. There was no stove, no fire, just a small grated opening in the floor at the center of the room, from which the impossible heat seemed to rise. "How?" Henriksen croaked, his voice a raw whisper. "How are you alive?" Elias looked down at the man who had ridiculed him, the man who had sentenced him and his family to death. He saw no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, quiet calm. "The fire is not in the house," Elias said simply. "The house is on the fire." He helped Henriksen to a chair and gave him a cup of hot broth. As the life slowly returned to the master builder's body, Elias explained. He spoke of the single, slow fire in the pit outside, a fire no bigger than a man's hat. He described how the stone roots drank the heat, how the earth held it, and how the floorboards breathed it into the room. One fire, warming two families, using less wood in 3 days than Henriksen's stove had consumed in 3 hours. Henriksen listened, his head bowed. The entire foundation of his knowledge, of his pride, of his identity had been demolished. He was a child, listening to a truth so simple and so profound, it felt like scripture. "My family," Henriksen finally managed to say, his voice thick with shame and fear. "My fire is out. We are freezing." Without a word, Elias put on his coat and boots. "Jakob," he called out, "Master Henriksen needs our help." Together, the 3 men fought their way through the storm to Jakob's cabin, where they were met with the same impossible, steady warmth. They gathered ropes and blankets. They made the perilous journey back to Henriksen's cold, dark house. They found his family huddled together, barely conscious. They wrapped them in blankets and, half carrying, half dragging them, brought them back to the impossible warmth of the Thorne homesteads. Henriksen's wife and children were taken into Jakob's cabin, while Henriksen himself stayed with Elias. He sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, watching his daughter sleep peacefully near the warmth of the floor grate. He, the master builder, the pillar of the community, was a refugee, saved by the very folly he had so arrogantly mocked. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was remade. It was a landscape of impossible sculptural beauty and profound devastation. The sun shone on a silent, white world. News of the survival of the Thorn families and their rescue of the Henriksons spread through the devastated community. Stories emerged of families found frozen in their homes, their woodpiles exhausted. The conventional wisdom had failed. The iron stoves had eaten all the wood and then allowed the cold to claim its victims. The Thorn cabins became a place of pilgrimage. Men came, hats in hand, their faces etched with grief and awe. They stood in the gentle, even warmth, and they did not understand. Master Henrikson, his pride burned away to a core of humble gratitude, became Elias's first and most fervent disciple. "Listen to this man," he told the others, his voice heavy with emotion. "He did not fight the winter. He made peace with it. He did not build on the land. He built with it. Everything I taught you was wrong." That spring, the digging began again. But this time, it was not two brothers working in isolation. It was a community. With Elias as their teacher and Henrikson as his foreman, they dug. They laid the stone roots. They connected house to house, family to family. They learned the quiet wisdom of the Yordvarma. Elias Thorn never became a loud or boastful man. He remained quiet, thoughtful. He had not sought vindication, only survival. But he had found something more. He had transformed the community. He had replaced a philosophy of desperate, individual struggle with one of shared, intelligent cooperation. The Dakota Root system became the new standard for prairie homes, a testament to the quiet innovator who listened to the whispers of his grandmother over the roar of accepted wisdom. Generations later, when people spoke of the Great Blizzard of '87, they would talk of the lives lost. But in that one small corner of the vast, cold prairie, they would also tell the story of the two brothers who dug a shared root, and of the single, gentle fire that kept a community alive. They had been given a sentence of death, but they had answered it by digging into the earth and finding the warmth of life itself.